In the previous Rebbe's memoirs, he tells a most interesting story. The memoirs of the previous Rebbe, which are called the Lubavitcher Rebbe's memoirs, were meant to be a history of the city of Lubavitch, not just of Lubavitch as the metropolis, as the center of the Chabad Hasidic movement, but the city of Lubavitch. And in the memoirs, it goes back to the birth of the city of Lubavitch, many hundreds of years prior to when the Alter Rebbe was born and lived in Lubavitch and so forth. And in the course of that, as it turns out, the vast majority of the memoirs that we have, which of course is unfinished, is about the Alter Rebbe's father, Reb Baruch. And it discusses at length his childhood and his young adulthood and his search. He was very, very intelligent, an incredible Talmud Chacham and Gaon, and with very deep integrity. He had terrific Yiddish Shamayim, and he was looking for the truth, for real, the real truth and for real. And he traveled a lot by foot from shtetl to shtetl, and he would sleep in Batei Medrash. And he so much wanted to be nehenem yegia kapov, not take anything from anybody and live on his own, even if it meant living in abject poverty and being able to sit and learn and daven all day and all night, except for the few hours a week or a month he dedicated to earning the pennies that allowed him to buy the bread to sustain himself. And he was incredibly sensitive to prying eyes, to people who would make an issue of him, and if people noticed him and began to celebrate him, he would just vanish, move on to the next town. But if people figured out how to leave him alone, sort of like not to overtly indicate how special he was and just let him be, he was very happy to make friends and to be hosted and to visit people's homes and so forth. And one of the wise Jews who figured this out was a simple man from the village of Dobra Misl, whose name was Reb Reuven. Reuven was a blacksmith, lived in Dobra Misl, and he was from the early inspirations or inspired ones of the Baal Shem Tov. He was a very simple man, and because of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples, he had begun to learn, and he actually sent his younger son off to Lita, to Lithuania, to learn in a yeshiva, and he came back a Talmud Chacham, a scholar. And one of the things that made Reuven so special was that because of the influence of the hidden tzaddikim in Russia at the time, when it came time to marry off his daughters, he sent to the yeshivas in the north, where there were still big yeshivas, to choose son-in-laws b'nei Teda, Talmidei Chachamim, which was uncommon at that time in that part of the world. And his three son-in-laws were all very big Talmidei Chachamim, who he was supporting. They were living in his home, and they made him very proud. The difference between the three of them was that the older two were in the older model. They were very scholarly and very pious, but very much to themselves. They didn't believe in assimilating and mingling with the common people and so forth. There was a certain condescension. The youngest of the three son-in-laws was a son of a chassid, of the Baal Shem Tov, by the name of Reb Nissen, the Malamed of Harki, and he was very much in the spirit of Chassidus. He was very warm, besimcha, and also very more open to the simpler people. And Reb Baruch would come to Reuven, the smith of Dobra Misl, and he was able to witness the two worlds, the traditional Torah world and the new inspired Hasidic Torah world. And he, for years and years, would visit and observe and question and analyze before he actually decided to become a Talmud of the Holy Baal Shem Tov. And there are so many wonderful little anecdotes that are related in the memoirs that describe this search and this struggle and this probing into the two worlds. And one of the more comical stories, if you will, is the story of Simchas Torah. It was the night of Simchas Torah, and this Yitzchak Shaul, this youngest of Reb Reuven's son-in-laws, walks up to Reb Baruch and says, "Watch, I want to show you something." And he goes over to the Gabbai and he tells the Gabbai in his ear that they were doing hakafas, and that the next hakafa he should announce is being given to the humblest man in town, to the biggest onav, to the humblest man in town. Of course, this was a practical joke, and the Gabbai was smart enough to understand that, and he said to Rabbi Yitzchak Shaul, "What do you mean ridiculous? That's so silly. I mean, if you want to identify the humblest man in town, mention him by name. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, try, just announce that this humblest man in town is invited to the first Sefer Torah of the fourth Hakafa, whatever it was. So the Gabbai was finally talked into it, and he bangs on the bim and he announces, Izmen Machabed, the first Sefer Torah of the fourth Hakafa is being honored to the humblest man in all of the Missile. And from all directions they came flying. And 4 or 5 people, most of them elderly, came, running as best they could to get the Sefer Torah. And one person got it, and then there was a whole line of people who came 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and 5th place. The following morning in the mikveh, Rabbi Yitzchak Shol met one of the people, and he says to him, it's evidence that you are the 4th humblest man in all of the Missile. He says, why would you say that? He says, well, you were the 4th one to arrive at the Sefer Torah. So he says, that's not because I'm the 4th humblest man in town, it's because there's 3 chutzpahniks who simply can run faster than I. And the point of the story speaks for itself. What I want to illustrate or bring forward from the story is the idea that the difference between humility and arrogance is not always in how it looks. People can look very humble and be very full of themselves. People can come across very confident and self-assured and assertive and in fact be quite humble. It's a subtlety. And one of the best measures of humility, if you're looking for one, is not to measure how a person acts or looks, but how much space there is between them and others. Humble people have no problem with people standing in their own space. Arrogant people build walls. And often the pretense of humility is another form of arrogance, which creates separations between one person and another. Truly humble people are inviting, they're philic, and truly arrogant people are phobic in their very psychological makeup. And another story which I think illustrates this even more acutely is in what's known in our culture, in the Chabad culture, as the Lange Brief, the long letter, which is a wonderful piece of history which the previous Rebbe wrote to the Rebbetzin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. It was given to her unfinished, and that's the way it remains. It's several hundred pages long, in print, I think, even. And it's a long, long story about a Jew by the name of Reb Mordechai, who was one of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, who had become so enamored, so taken with Chassidus, that he decided that he must go find his 2 childhood friends, Reb Chaim and Rabbi Socher Ber, and bring them to the Baal Shem Tov. And of course the end was he succeeded and brought his 3 friends, him and his 2 friends, to the Baal Shem Tov. And as the story finishes, it was these 3 Chassidic personalities, Reb Mordechai, Reb Chaim, and Rabbi Socher Ber, who brought Chassidus to White Russia, to Belarusia, where Lubavitch is. And he describes in length how this Reb Mordechai went to look for his old friend Rabbi Socher Ber, and en route he coincidentally bumped into Reb Chaim, and he spent weeks and months, I think maybe even a year, together with this old friend of his, Reb Chaim, trying to warm him up to Chassidus. And the story goes through all kinds of stages, how Reb Mordechai meets his old friend, and he's got blinders on his eyes and cotton in his ears and cotton up his nose. He shouldn't hear and see and smell. And he's studying Torah day and night in what was called in those days precious, perfect isolation from the world and in a state of exalted piety and so forth. And Reb Mordechai, who's been influenced by Chassidus, is so disturbed by the condition of his former friend that one of the more dramatic moments of the story is that the Mordechai wants to scream at Reb Chaim, take the cotton out of your ears, the cotton out of your nose, the blinders off your eyes. Zaya mensch, Viala mentioned, be a normal human being. But he understands that his old friend Reb Chaim is so far away from being able to understand what's wrong with this behavior that there's no point in speaking to him. He's got to get his attention. He's only going to get his attention on his terms, which he does successfully. It's really, really wonderful to read this letter because it's so detailed. It goes into literally thought processes of people and explains what is unique about the thought process of a chassid. And part of that is, I think this is summarized by one of those wonderful quotable quotes from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who says, Toiva haprishus im abrius, v'habedidus b'tayich b'nei adam, which means it's good to be aloof, holy, with other people, and to find solitude in the community, which means be amongst people and yet Don't be like people. Find a way of having your own quiescence, your own quietness, your own space, your own purity. And this is a Hasidic ideal. Hasidim knew how to laugh. Hasidim knew how to love. Hasidim knew how to assimilate. And Hasidim knew how to be Hasidim, righteous at the same time. And this is true humility, as opposed to pretended humility or rigid humility and so forth. This is real. This is real. There's a wonderful little anecdote with a chassid of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. There was a well-known chassid, a famous chassid, whose name was Reb Nata. Reb Natale from Malastritznia. He was a Rov. He was a Goan. He was also a very big chassid and a big oivid. It's known that the Middle Rebbe had said that his effect on his Hasidim was that he had 2.5 Hasidim. 2 Hasidim had met his standards entirely, and 1 had met them halfway. And the 2 that met it entirely were Reb Hillel of Parish and Reb Nata of Malastritznia. He was an incredibly humble man with absolutely no sense of self, notwithstanding the fact that he was so extraordinarily great in Torah and in Chassidus and in Avodah and in Midas Tevis and so forth. So the story was that it was shavuos, and shavuos in Lubavitch was very, very special because all the great Rabbonim would come to the Lubavitch to be with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek for shavuos. They couldn't go Pesach or Sukkot for obvious reasons. They had responsibilities. So shavuos was a happening time in Lubavitch. All the Rabbonim would come. And in fact, there was a special meal, the milchike suda, the milk meal, the dairy meal, the first day shavuos, was just for the Rabbonim and the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and it was called a nigletish. And the Tzemach Tzedek would speak an inyan and nigla, lomdus, and then the Rabbonim would ask questions. It was a quick but very meaningful event. So during one of these nigletishin on the first day shavuos, the Tzemach Tzedek took a glass and he brewed a poisonous brew. He put in a little bit of every imaginable kind of intoxicating drink, creating a mix which was lethal. It was undrinkable. And he fills up a glass with all these various different mashkois, drinks, and he turns to one of his sons and says, "Here, drink it." And he watched his father fill his glass. It was not consumable. So he says, "I'm sorry, I cannot drink it." So he offers it to another son, and they all turn it down. And then he offers it to the various Hasidim sitting around the table, and no one wants to drink it. At the back of the room, in the corner, sitting this Reb Nata in his own world, and the Tzemach Tzedek says, "Git is noten. Nata is ayin. When ayin is neisi hafcham. Give it to this chassid, Reb Nata. Nata is ayin. Ayin you cannot translate in English. Literally means a thing of nothing. An entity that has no form, no self-awareness, no pretenses, no airs. And ayin can tolerate contradictions." So they shove the glass to the end of the table. They say to the Reb Nata, the Tzemach Tzedek said, "Drink." So he downed it. He drank the whole cup. And when he was finished, one of the Hasidim leaned over and whispered to him, "You heard the Rebbe just gave you a great compliment. The Rebbe said you're ayin." In other words, that you're so humble, you're so nothing in the presence of God that you have no form at all, which is, in truth, was an extraordinary compliment. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, yeah. So Reb Nata says, yeah, garnished, taka garnished. This chassid Reb Nata didn't even notice that he was complimented. All he heard was that Tzemach Tzedek said he was nothing, and he agreed. He was in fact nothing, because it wasn't an act. This was a real person, and he was truly in a state of genuine lack of self-awareness. And when the Rebbe said he was ayin, he took it exactly in that spirit. I tell these stories as we introduce this Maamar, which is short, because there's something very interesting that is being presented here in this Maamar. This Maamar discusses, to a great extent, the word bittul. Now, over the years, I have looked for an English translation for the word bittul and have failed to find one. So I say that the English translation of bittul is bittul. What does it mean? Self-nullification, humility, self-imposed nothingness? I don't know. There's just no good word for bittul. Bittul means a person who's so busy with his task that he doesn't notice himself. Bittul means being in the service of God to the extent that the I, the capital I, is gone. All there is the service. It is a human ideal, it is certainly a Jewish ideal, and it is especially a Chassidic ideal. And bittul has many levels and many forms. When you force yourself to do things against your wishes because God wants, that's a form of bittul. When you successfully integrate the will of God into your mind, heart, and senses, it's also a form of bittul. But they're very different. The first is very imposed, very forced, and the second is very peaceful and very integrated. But the second is less intense. In other words, if you're going to serve God, and in the service of God you're going to have to achieve bittul, the stronger the bittul, the less natural it'll seem. The more natural and harmonious the bittul seems with the bottle, with the person who is in a state of bittul, the more limited the bittul is. This Maamar, if I understand it correctly, is proposing the idea that a person can be totally bottle and at the same time entirely at peace with his bittul. Totally bottle means when the measure of subservience of one to God is absolute. It's not simply sacrificing my will or my ego, but the person is completely transformed into bittul to Hashem. And at the same time, this Maamar suggests that it's possible for that bittul to be in a perfect state of harmony, where you're not suppressing or crushing or forcing yourself, but you're being transformed into this state of bittul. That's what this Maamar is going to address. And as you'll see as the Maamar unfolds, he's going to argue that you can find such a phenomenon amongst animals. And we'll have to struggle to understand what that means. And of course the argument is going to be you can find it in the animal within a person, and it has to do with the animal's source, which is higher than the human source, and so forth, as the Maamar will teach. But let's begin. The introduction's been long enough. The Maamar begins with the pasuk. Vehanif hakoyin oisam. The koyin will lift up the 7 sheep and the 2 breads of chametz, which are for shtei lechem. Al lechem habikurim, the animals will be on top of the bread, tenufu, as it's lifted up of Hashem before God, al shnei hakvasim, on top of the 2 sheep. Now let me first explain this to you in niglet terms. We many times have offerings that involve an animal, and then meal, flour, and then wine and oil. The rule is that the primary aspect of the sacrifice is the animal, and the meal and the wine and the oil are a supplement, are secondary. There are 2 exceptions to that rule. The first is the oime, which is brought on Pesach, and the second is the shtei lechem. Shtei lechem was a wheat offering brought on shavuos, which was the only offering brought in the Beis HaMikdash all year long that was chametz, that was leavened bread, because all the offerings in the Beis HaMikdash were matzah, and this chametz would actually not go on the mizbeach. But what's unusual about it is that in this particular case, you didn't bring bread along with animals, you brought animals along with bread. It was actually the bread that was destined to be the sacrifice, and along with the sacrifice came the animal. So the kvasim are al shtei halechem. The bread are the real issue, and the animals are coming as a supplement to the bread, as opposed to how it normally would be, where the animals are the primary sacrifice, and the bread would be supplemental to that. And that's what this pasuk is describing. Al lechem habikurim, that the animals are brought as a supplement, as a additional korban to the bread, which was brought in the Beis HaMikdash, which of course allowed us to eat, allowed us to use chadash for karbanis and so forth, like it's explained in halach. And let's read on. The Gemara teaches us shahalechem milmaila, that the bread goes on top of the animals. In other words, the bread was lifted with the animals. But in this particular case, it was the bread that was primary and the animal that was supplemental. Says the whole Rebbe let's explain the relationship between bread and animals and kvasim and sheep. In this particular context, where the sheep are secondary to the bread as opposed to vice versa. In this union, for the animals are raised up with the bread in a circumstance where what is primary is the bread and what is secondary is the animal. And the Rebbe immediately digresses. Line 4. That we all know. Kitach, let's call abriya. The purpose of creation is lihiyes, to effect that ayesh bot oliyayah, that the ego, that the independent form, that the self-absorbed or consumed or aware being that has a certain measure of separateness from God, which is truly a lie, because in fact Nothing has a separateness from God. But in its own perception, it has a certain measure of detachedness, of separateness from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, should become bottled again, should re-bittle itself to its creator. In other words, each creation, each being should become aware of the truth, which is that everything is Hashem, and express it in their existence in a state of bittul. In each world, the bittul of one's ego is relative to that particular world. And the Rabbi goes on to explain Vehine, line 5. What is the highest form of bittul? That a particular being become entirely bittul and included in the infinite light of godliness. In other words, a bittul which is not simply giving away my ego, where I hold onto my self-identity, but I do what God says instead of what I say, but that the entire self-identity, the entire self, the entire personality is transformed in its bittul to the Ein Sof. And it's entirely one with the Ein Sof. V'amiti, and truly one with the Ein Sof. B'tachos hayichud, the greatest measure of oneness. And here is the metaphor that's of note. Line 6. Ki his achtos evrei haguf, as the union that can take place between the physical limbs of a body, b'nefesh hachayunas, with the soul of vitality, hashedu mislabish b'techem, which is manifest and revealed within the body. And the way the body lives from the soul is such, she'ein lehem chayis acher. The body has no other source of life, mi baladei chayis hanefesh, other than the soul. And the fusion and the union between the body and the soul is therefore so total and whole. V'lachein, and therefore, ha'ivorem nishmoim l'ratzon hanefesh. The body, the limbs, do as the soul wills, bebittul v'sachtas gama, with a perfect bittul and unification, that it responds to what the neshama wants spontaneously and immediately. You see, when we talk about the relationship between the neshama and the guf, the soul and the body, we talk a lot about harmony. Harmony means a good match. The soul and the body match. They're aligned in such a way where the soul is not too strong so as not to overwhelm the body. The body is not too crude so as to hide over the soul. They match. They're aligned in such a way that they affect a perfect hislapshus pnimia, a perfect meeting of body and soul. Here it is another point, that just as the body and soul are in such a state of harmony, one should be in a total bittul to Ein Sof. Now normally when something is very bittul, it's broken, it's pushed away, it's overwhelmed. On the other hand, when something is in a state of harmony, the bittul is limited to the body's possibility for limit. Here the Maamar wants to join these two ideas, these two opposite ideas, and say there's an idea of complete bittul to Hashem that is at the same time entirely harmonious. In other words, where something is bittul to Hashem in an infinite way, and yet it's perfectly at peace with that infinite bittul. That's very, very special and very unusual, and that's what this Maamar is describing. And he continues and he says, V'kach, just as we understand the measure of harmony of bittul between the body and the soul. And in this particular case, we're talking about it being on the highest levels. The faculties of the animal soul should be totally bottled to the Ein Sof, which rests and hovers over a person's soul. Just as my body listens to my soul, my animal soul should listen to my divine soul, with complete and spontaneous acquiescence and in a complete state of harmony. And of course that doesn't happen. We all have an ego, we all have paranoias, we all have shtick, we all have jealousies and separations between us and our fellow and so forth and so on. All of this is animalism. The godly soul is bottled to the Eibishter. And who achieves such a harmony that the animal soul is not only entirely subservient to the divine soul, but it's not a forced subservience. It's an harmonious, it's a integrated, it's a unifying bittul. And yet this is what this Maamar is describing. And he continues on line 9 and he says, to be sure, in as much as human beings are concerned, cannot be. No way a human being can physically be this bottled to godliness. In other words, any nimtza begashmi is klal. It is not found physically at all. That one should put aside his will for the will of his fellow. Now people do that all the time. If you're a subservient, you put on your will for your boss or for your commander or for your superior, but you're not happy about it. You're frustrated about it. You're resentful of it. The idea that one should physically be in such a state of bittul to his superior and be at peace with it, says the Alter Rebbe, simply doesn't happen. bebechinas bittel zeh, and this kind of bittel, keilu, to the extent that it's as though ein leilas nachaklal, there is no other will. It can't be. You can be bottled to a degree. You can put your will aside and your ego aside for another to a degree. You can also be at peace with the wishes and the commands of your superior, but then you have to be comfortable with those wishes and commands, which makes the bittul limited as well. But complete bittul and complete harmony cannot exist in the human condition. Now, but when it says here in the Maamar that the idea is to achieve this bittul, it means that the impossible should actually occur in people. But how? Listen to the next line. V'hine ela. However, teva zu hi bebehema. Animals can have this much bittul. Animals can be totally bottled to their master and be in harmony with this bittul. Now, some people will say that this is a class for animal lovers. It raises animals up on such a pedestal. I frankly don't understand what this means. What do you mean an animal can be so bottled and in such harmony? Animals are animals. And the only way I can understand this is that you'll see later on he divides animals into categories: domestic animals, wild animals, birds, and fish. And he makes the case that domestic animals are, as we know from anthropology and sociology, they are animals, that can be domesticated. The reason they've domesticated the goat, the sheep, the cow, the horse, is because they have a tendency towards domestication in their nature. Other animals are far more difficult to domesticate because of their natures as well. And domestication is a subservience. Everybody knows how you herd sheep. In every herd of sheep, there's always a lead herd, and you can insert yourself instead of that lead sheep, and you become de facto a sheep, and the sheep will follow you as they would an ordinary sheep. There's something very, very subservient about that, and something very peaceful about it. In a herd of sheep, the herded are not objecting to the herder. It's just their nature. They follow. So the Rebbe argues, when you look at domestic animals specifically, and particularly those species of animals that are used in karbanos, you find that in their nature, even though they're animals of course are completely selfish and not at all creative, and not at all in a state of transcendence. They live for grass and whatever else it is that they eat, yet they have built into their personalities the tendency to be bottle, to follow a lead, and to do it in such a way that they're happy about this bittul. And the Alter Rebbe is arguing that the bittul that you see in domestic animals is coming from something very holy. As it is in domestic animals, I guess some people would call it, that's just a symptom of their dumbness, or their wish to survive because of large numbers. But the argument Alter Rebbe puts is that in each individual animal there is this tendency towards accepting authority, and accepting it in such a way which it's completely at peace with it, because animals' high source, in other words, the angel, which is the source of these animals, is in a deep sense of bittul to Hashem, and it also is bittul to Hashem in a very peaceful way, and that's the source of the fact that these animals down here have similar tendencies. I'm on line 10 if you lost me. This nature exists in domestic animals, that's the argument, she'im betelim, because they have it within themselves to be bittul. But it's saying hamanhigam, the will of their herder and their leader. Do whatever he wishes. And they're completely loyal to the leader of their group, and they will never deviate, and they'll do whatever they're told. So when you look at domestic animals and you see their herder tendencies, and of course, in science, everything has a scientific explanation. But in mysticism, everything has a mystical explanation. So Kabbalah is arguing, this Maamar is arguing, that this phenomena of animals being such willing followers is a symptom of something holy, although as it manifests in the physical animal, it's simply biology. What's the holy source or origin of this tendency towards giving away your will to another completely and being happy about it? Says the Rebbe, domestic animals have a very high source in mysticism. The very highest levels of the Ein Sof. In that source, whatever animal exists on high is totally bottled to the Ein Sof and in complete harmony with that bittul. Skip the parenthesis, line 13. So Adam, the physical animals obviously are much lower than human beings because of what's called the shviras hakelim, the toyu, the shattering of the vessels of toyu. And this affects that animals on here should have a natural subservience under people, But as animals are subservient to people, there's no service, there's no worship, there's no sacrifice, and there's no God. But the physical tendencies we see in animals down here are symptoms of a supernal tendency in animals as they exist on high. All of us know about this business of Shviras HaKelim of Toyu, that God created a polar world which shattered, and the very high sparks of this polar world, which was replaced by a balanced and integrated world, fell. And that's what Klipa is. Klipa is lower than Kedusha and has a higher source. Accordingly, animals are lower than human beings and have a higher source. And the argument, of course, here is that specifically domestic animals that are so cooperative, if you will, so bottle, down here, it's a biological thing. It has an explanation based on survival and groupings and so forth and so on. But in real truth, the reason why this is physically so is because mystically and spiritually they are linked to their source. And in the source are totally bottled to Hashem. Line 15, V'zeu, and this is why, that inyan HaKarbones shaya makriven habehem al gabi hamizbeach, which is why most sacrifices are domestic animals. In fact, all sacrifices are domestic animals. Ve'elech hayosah b'mkedev v'sharsha, and the vitality of the animal is raised up to its source and its root to reveal down here that higher source of bittul, which is not just a bittul to a herder, but a bittul to God Almighty. V'sharsha shubachin is bittul mamash ben Eitzev baruch hu, which is a bittul to the Ein Sof. Says the Rebbe, line 16, v'akabonas, and as a rule, sacrifice hayim and abehema menatzein mikol abehema. It was only from cattle and from sheep amongst all species of animal. That's number one. And there's no wild animals, there's no undomesticated animals that sacrifice. Even kosher animals like deer, which are also kosher, and antelope, but they're wild, and they're much less prone, they're much more difficult to herd. People have historically tried to herd caribou, reindeer, but it's not the same thing as herding goats and sheep. It's in their nature to follow. And this Maamar argues this has to do with the supernal tendency towards bittul, which manifests down here in this herding tendency. In domestic animals, you see this bittul more manifest than in wild animals because of their higher source. So we're learning something very, very interesting. If you want to understand the mysticism of, I guess you can't call it anthropology, you can call it animal behavior. The reason we've domesticated certain animals is because they have a natural tendency towards herding, towards gathering together in groups and being led by one leader. And the reason this way physically is because they have a very high mystical source. Now, but amongst herding animals, this Maamar argues the most herdable of the herdable are sheep, kvasim. Amongst all domestic animals, nivchru kvasim. Sheep are the most herding. Al piarov, in most cases, sacrifices the vast majority of karbonos tzibur. In the Beis Hamikdash were sheep as opposed to cattle or goats. Because, in other words, amongst domestic animals that have this bittul, this herding tendency, is found most amongst sheep. Cattle come from the left side, which means they have a certain strength to them. Which is really mature cattle. Minagech bakane have a tendency to gore. There's a certain anger about them. Kabbalistically, goats also have a tendency to gevura, which means to say the other domestic animals that are used in karbonos have a little bit more cockiness, a little bit more rebelliousness or insubordination. In their nature, while sheep, they're naturally soft and compassionate and cooperative. As the Pasuk describes, Vakvasim Hifrid Yankov Avinu, of course, herded sheep. And in the Chumash, the stories relate that he herded sheep first as he was shepherding Lavan's flocks, and then later on as he was herding his own flocks and separating them from Lavan's flocks so that he earned his sheep fair and square and so forth. And the Torah describes Vakvasim, the sheep of Yankov Avinu's flocks, he separated from those of Esau's flocks. Now the simple translation of the word Hifrid means he separated one flock from another flock. Here we translate something else. He separates each flock from its supernal source, from its higher source. In other words, the physical animals, Yankov separated from the highest of sources of these same animals. Sheep have the tendency of Yankov Avinu, which is compassion. And how do you see this physically? Sheep have a very bleating sound, a very compassion-evoking bleat. That it makes people feel compassion. The reason for this physical tendency is because Shemakedim Vesharsham, their root and source and root. Humadrega is a very high level. Shumakerach, which is a source of compassion, and from that compassion also comes the softness needed for this herding tendency described before. As the sheep's vitality falls from the highest levels of the Ein Sof to be physical sheep, they retain that voice that symbolizes this tendency towards compassion and softness, because the physical animal's nature is, at least indirectly, a reflection of its supernal source and nature. They're naturally biologically weaker than the other animals. You see represented in them this nature towards bittul. So, physical animals, namely sheep, have a tendency towards bittul, which is a symptom of their highest source. And remember again, that when we talk of bittul in this Maamar, there are two priorities. Number one, total bittul, and number two, completely harmonious bittul. It's represented by sheep. Line 26 of Beis V'hinei. As we witness sheep down here in the physical world, they're called kvasim. Kvasim means sheep. But you can spell kvasim in two ways. The more conventional spelling is kvasim, which is habeis kedem l'shin, the base before the shin. But the unconventional is haksavim, the shin before the base. What's the difference? If the base comes before the base would be chokhmah, and the shin would be the 6 meters. Alternatively, if the shin comes before the base, so shin would go on kesed, and the base would go on chokhmah. So the argument is that on shavuos, the sheep that brought with the bread is ksavim and not kavasim. It's the sheep where the shin is before the base, which goes on a very high source. And my problem is that in the Chumash you don't really find this. I'm a bit confused about why the Alter Rebbe is able to say this about these psukim, when in these psukim they're always called kvasim and they're never called ksavim. And he explains himself. The base is an allusion to chokhmah because it's the second letter which goes on chokhmah. Chokhmah builds homes. Shin reim is the gimel kavim, and the shin goes on the 3 pillars. The shape of a shin is 3 points, 3 lines meeting at a point, which goes on the 3 primary emotions, which shows on diversity. Which come from the mind. However, when we talk about the relationship between animals and bittul in their source, it's the other way around, that the shin is before the base. That in the shin, they're completely one. V'sham nemer kesev hashin kedin lebein, the shin comes first. Shashin umidas al yein, the shin is an allusion to the supernal emotions shalom ma'alam yachach, which is beyond reason. In other words, emotions towards Hashem which are super rational. V'seichel and wisdom. V'nikra b'zeh yatur de prudet chashechet kol nazeh, mountains of darkness. So you have kvasim means the physical animal that's an animal. In this animal, you see certain tendencies that reflect a bittul and a softness. And ksavim would be the animal that is in its source. And the Torah tells us, "V'haksavim hifred Yankov." Yankov separates the ksavim, the sheep in their source. Translates the Maimish. Yankov who? It is Yankov Avinu hu hamam shech bechinas haksavim, to bring down the source of this tendency in animals. From their category and step. In their source, to a separate world. There should be sheep down here. In other words, Yaakov Avinu was a shepherd. And the mystical effect of Yaakov's shepherding is that the source of sheep should be brought down to the physical sheep and not separated from the physical sheep. There should be a sense of the prud in the world of diversity and separation. If klipa, of physical animals that love to eat grass, and that's about it, you should reveal the source of those animals, which is the bittul, bringing the regular offerings in the Beis HaMikdash, where the sheep represented compassion, where the sheep represented higher than Atzilus, and the idea of bringing them down to the physical animals in this world, that in those physical animals we should see a similar bittul. And the Rebbe goes on to explain in line 33, the idea is this. The mornings. Now wait, I want to explain to you what he's saying. The Beis HaMikdash is opened with a sheep and closed with a sheep. And there's a different reason why the Beis HaMikdash begins and ends with a sheep. The idea is this, line 33. Cattle is an allusion to Avram Avinu's midah. I'm sorry, boiker. Who Boiket Avram. The morning is the morning of Avram Avinu Bechinas, Chassidel in the supernal kindness. Shemespasha, they didn't say Baruch Hu L'mayla Din Ketz L'mat Adin Tachas. The infinity of godliness comes down from the highest level to the lowest levels. And he explains, as it descends from heaven to earth from step to step. The Samadreg is descending through the steps. Through the chain reaction of worlds. And of course, it reveals itself in each world according to its limited status. That's what the word hislapshus means. Each world getting godliness that it can receive, like the limbs and the body analogy I said earlier. Klipa can nourish, can leach. Since the chayes of kedusha is measured and limited, klipa can leach off it. Bechinas ali keter. Avraham actually said erroneously that Yishmael could live in the service of Hashem, thinking that klipa can take from kedusha in such a way that it will achieve a bittul. And therefore, in order to protect the godly revelations of kindness from going to a bad place, you need a shmir. You first bring an animal sacrifice in the very beginning of the morning in the Beis HaMikdash. And the significance of this initial animal was Shubachinas Bittel Bachinas Rachamonis. It's a humble animal, it's a subservient animal. It's a bittel animal, which has in its tendency compassion. That the godliness should be brought only to a place of bittel. That godliness should be manifest only in those who are battle. And this is the significance of a sheep, which was brought as the opening sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash each day. The Talmud shall shachar or boiker to open up a day with a bittel. How is this animal representative of bittel? Because its source is very deeply bittel. And of course, in the evening, the Beis HaMikdash was closed again with a sheep. That this is man shlitas midas yitzchak. The afternoon is the time of midah of yitzchak, which is bechinas gevuras, which is the attribute of gevura, and the purpose is lamtika to make them sweet for cholu and so forth. And the Rabbi says, "V'amshachas beis bechinas bittel zeh," bringing forward these two bittels. Or zeh beis kvas, these are represented by the two sheep. Bechinas beik, and bechinas beinor b'ayim, the morning and the afternoon sheep. And who is the tzaddik? Who is the one that brings down from the source of the physical animals into the physical animal? That the bittel should be a bittel to Hashem and not bittel to some shepherd. It's Nasai, the Yankov, as what Yankov Avinu Shu Bechinas Briach, the Yankov Avinu was from the highest level, therefore he descends the lowest. Lekach Hif, the Yankov was. Yankov was the one to create the physical sheep. Mi Bechinas Ksafa, from the source of sheep, which is so bottled to the Yebishter. The Shahol, Yubim McCain, and Vishashan, in their root and source, they were totally bottled. The Bechinas Kvasim, La'alma, the Pruda, to sheep in the physical, separated world, where they're not naturally bottled to the Yebishter, to be divided up into various different categories, types, and levels, and so forth and so on. In short, animals have a certain tendency, and the reason for this tendency, in truth, is the bittel they have in their source, and Yankov Avinu was the one whose efforts as a shepherd brought that bittel down from the highest levels to the lowest levels. I mean, in light, let me just tell you the story. I know I've told it to you before. The Aptarov, the great and holy Aptarov, Rabbi Avraham Yeshua Heschel of Apt, was a very interesting man. He used to say he remembered every prior Gilgul, every prior incarnation that he had. He said that he was a Kohen Gadol in one Gilgul, and on Yom Kippur, when he would recite the Avodah, he would not say V'kach hoya oymen. This is what the high priest used to say. He said instead V'kach hayisi oymen. This is what I would say as a high priest. In addition, he had a huge birthmark on his back, in the shape of a crimson line that ran across his back on an angle, a red strip. So he said that one of my earlier Gilgulim was a sheep in Yankov Avinu's herds, and I was actually Maaseh, the tie, the 10th one, and Yankov hit me with a red dye to indicate that I'm supposed to be a carbon. Now to think that the Aptarov was a tzaddik gomor, was a sheep in Yankov Avinu's herds, puts a perspective on what we know about greatness and holiness and tzaddikim and so forth. But Yankov Avinu brings down the bittel from the source to the physical animal. Now, our Maamar is saying that a carbon of a sheep is trying to harness the bittel source of the sheep that we see indicated in the behavior of the physical animal to bring into this world this incredible bittel. Now, what is the conventional commentary of how that transpires? The physical animal is a physical animal. The mystical source of the animal is extraordinarily lofty and by no means physical, and certainly not an animal. What's the link between the physical animal that's being sacrificed and its mystical source? So the conventional answer is, you're destroying the animalism, the negativity, finding the positive within the animal and raising that up. So in effect, when you're sacrificing a physical animal in the hope of accessing its mystical source, you do it through sacrifice. You destroy the animal, and what's left of the animal, the best of the animal, can be raised up to the level of man, and then to what is higher than man, which is this source of the animal. Here we have something quite different, because the animal is being brought with bread. And the argument is there's nothing animalistic about bread. Bread of wheat is human food as opposed to animal food. So when you put bread with an animal and make the bread primary and the animal secondary, you cannot speak of sacrifice as you normally would. In other words, the typical understanding of a sacrifice is where you're killing the animal, taking out the blood and spilling it, and taking what is left, the richness of it, putting it on the mizbeach, and what is left you eat and raise it up from an animal to a man, and then from a man to, in effect, a superman, higher than man, which is the source of the animal. You can only say that if you view the animal as the negative, as the primary point. But here the animal is coming with bread. Now bread is already considered human. So if this sacrifice is about bread, which is for human beings to consume, and the animal is coming along with that bread, this animal also must have a human element to it. Where and how? And that's what the Maamar now says. Line 43. Ach b'shavuos, on the holiday of Shavuos. And the Pasuk says, V'hei nevakein esam al lechem v'gemer, al shnei kvasim, that the key was the bread. And the sheep was secondary to the bread, as opposed to the other way around, which was how it normally was. In other words, the physical animals are being raised, or the physical sheep are being raised to the root and source on high, ksavim, sheep as they exist on high, which represents that they be totally bottled to Hashem. Now, what's total bittul? The 2 points made it before, completely subservient and totally at peace with the subservience. But in this case, v'hainu im alachem, that's how it goes with bread. So there's not an animal being sacrificed, there is something human being sacrificed, along with the animal aspect. Line 45, the sacrifice of bread is very different than the sacrifice of an animal. An animal is a negative thing being transformed, and bread is positive, being raised up. Kine beis alechem, the fact that there were 2 loaves, this goes on the 2 concepts of bread mystically, which is not animalistic at all, but rather the written and oral Torahs. So as we find l'chu lachmu, come, let us dine, b'lachmi, with my bread, v'chuli, and it's alternatively interpreted l'chu lachmu, go and engage in a battle with my bread, because any involvement in consumption of physical things is a struggle, spiritually speaking. These 2 breads have a very lofty source. The breads represent human food as opposed to animal food. There's an aspect in the written Torah which the oral Torah does not possess. And then, of course, there's an aspect in the oral Torah which the written Torah does not possess. What's the difference between Torah shebeksav and Torah shebal peh? In a word, Torah shebeksav is godly. And Torah shebal peh is comprehensible. So which is better? Obviously, godliness is higher than intellectualism, but intellectualism is more real. Alternatively, intellectualism, we're able to understand and analyze and be creative, and in godliness, all you can do is what we call in our culture, Kabbalah, accept. So it's the combination. So he explains. You have, on the one hand, advantages to Scripture, Torah shebeksav, in its godly aspect, as it's represented by it's the melodies, the musical notes in the Torah, the trop. Zarka, Makav, Shefer, Helech, Skulta, V'chulu. These are a very different set of trop than the ones we have. It's a long story. Shem Bechinas Nigan, Bechinas Mesikas V'taynik. It's music, which is sweet and delightful. V'yalzenem, as the Pasuk described, V'hi Shiri Chamishav Elef, 1,005 Mishalim. Obalayla, Shiri Imi, alternatively at night we sing. In other words, Sha'ataimim, that the musical notes of the Torah, Hein Bechinas Shiri V'nigan, their music. L'nagin b'shira v'zimra, to sing with great joy and gladness. V'rev simcha v'tanim, great joy and delight. Sha'ataimim elu hem b'teira shebeksav v'lei b'teira shebal peh. These musical notes are in the written Torah and not in the oral Torah. Moreover, ve'ein b'Torah shebal peh, the oral Torah does not at all have shum pirush ubiur ala taimim, no clarification for these musical notes. Levayir lefarish lanu shira zumai, to explain what the idea is. In Kabbalah, there's a discussion called tante, taimim the kodesh tagamesis, which means that Torah has 4 levels. The lowest level are the letters themselves, which take up 2 dimensions. The second level are the crowns, which take up 1 dimension. The third level are the vowels that take up no dimensions, but they're enunciated and pronounced. And the highest dimension is the taimim. In other words, there's a lot of secrets in Torah Shebeksav. And the higher you go, the less revealed the secrets are and the more sublime they are. And the highest level is the level of Torah which is called music, delightful, pleasure. The oral Torah in no way can mirror this. The oral Torah can only take from the letters and the words of the Torah, perhaps the crowns also, like Rabbi Kiva did, but not higher. The musical notes behind the Torah Shebeksav is beyond the usual reach of the practitioners of Torah Shebal Peh interpreting halacha. On the other hand, the oral Torah explains what was initially a foundation and a root of a mitzvah. To explain it thoroughly, it's the oral Torah that makes clear to us how and what mitzvahs are, as opposed to the written Torah. There's no single mitzvah in the written Torah that will not be in need of an explanation and a clarification in the oral Torah, how to perform a particular mitzvah, and in which fashion. In other words, the strength of the Torah Shebeksav is its godliness. The strength of its Torah Shebal Peh is its comprehensiveness. Says the Rebbe, the 2 breads are raising up the 2 dimensions of Torah. And we raise up the 2 breads l'mayla on high b'meked and v'sharsh in the source and root. To become one with the Ein Sof. Because although Torah and the intellectual ideas of Torah are by themselves very lofty, there's still a certain measure. And as the ideas of Torah are raised up to the level of Ein Sof, Kisham, in the Ein Sof HaMiyuchad is B'tachas HaYichad, they're absolutely one, and on shavuos, the primary sacrifice is the bread to raise up this that's already bottled on the level of the Torah Shebeksav and Torah Shebal Peh to a total bittul for the Yebishter. And along with this bread comes sheep. Ubahen val yadin, and through these breads, misyachtim gam chayes akvasim, we raise up the vitality of these sheep that are physically herders because of their nature. And to become bottled in their root and source on high. To be in a complete state of bittul. So, in contrast to the typical carbon, where you're sacrificing an animal so that what's left can be raised up, here you're sacrificing something human to raise up the animal along with the humanness. As I've told you so many times in our lectures, that the word carbon can mean to sacrifice and the word carbon can mean to bring close. What's the difference? Sacrificing is destroying one thing to create another. Bringing close is taking what it is as it is and raising it up. The animal aspect of a sacrifice is sacrificial, to transform. The human aspect of a sacrifice is to ascend, to effect raising something up. Here we have an animal coming along with bread, as opposed to bread coming along with an animal, how it would normally be. So it's a sacrifice connecting to the godly soul, to the intellectual soul, which is indirectly schlepping the animal soul along. The reason this is possible, or one of the ways to see an indication of what's unusual about this, is in the fact that these 2 breads brought on shavuos ksiv chametz te'afena. They were the only communal offering brought all year long that was supposed to be chametz. What does it show? That this offering is on such a high level that even chametz can be raised up. That this bread is raised up to the source of its vitality. And the source of life for everything created down here is a very high source. That's higher than the source of time, which is their life. And they're being created. That since godliness, which is their source, is concealed and hidden from them, It's not revealed in them down here. They appear separate. The reason physical animals are animals because their spiritual source is removed from them. When you bring the physical animal through the sacrifice back to its source, where the focus is on sacrificing the bread, the mind of the person, and the animal comes along, so it goes back to its source, to the source of time, nasu gamheim. So the animal is also transformed, his nasus shalamayla, exaltedness on high. In other words, that the physical animal is going from being keves to being kesem. And of course, in avoided, this means that the person's nefesh habahamis goes from being keves to being kesev, because they're included in their source. So, the bittul of harmony exists in the source of the animal, and on shavuos, it is the mensch within the carbon that facilitates, makes it possible for the animal within the carbon to become raised up. Line 62. It just explains the difference. Sheben kif, I said, as the two sheep that were brought with the breads on shavuos. And to the two animals that were brought each day also from sheep, as the carbon tamid. And the explanation is as follows. The two sheep brought on shavuos that were chametz were brought along with, the two breads in the base of mikdash that were chametz were brought along with sheep that were peace offerings. What does that mean? That were eaten by people. While the two offerings brought with the sheep in the morning and at night, completely consumed by the mizbeach. Now, what is better? A carbon completely consumed by the mizbeach, or a carbon eaten in part by man? Now, of course, the conventional wisdom would be that the former is better, but in fact, it's the opposite. When an animal has to be totally sacrificed, it's because you don't trust that people can consume it properly. When an animal is only sacrificed in part, and the rest of it is consumed, it shows on such a harmony that the human being is trusted that his eating will have the favorable effect. And it's the same here. The idea is the animals down here are very separated from their source. And as the animals are down here and separated from their source, consequently, the human being can't eat it. Because the human being would consume. The animal sacrificed on the lower level, it would drag the person down. And Klip will get more life, and therefore it's a complete carbon. In other words, physical animals down here are so crude that the only way to elevate them is to burn them up. And if you try consuming them, they'll drag you down. As opposed to shavuos. They're secondary to the bread which is already meichel in their source. To go back to the source of kvasim, which means sheep down here, to the source of ksod, which means sheep on high. Moreover, they become included with the two breads. So when the physical animals are not just being raised up to a relative source, but to their absolute source, in Ein Sof, which is completely beyond any limitations, and it's coming along with the two breads, which goes on the Torah, Shalmein Shlita v'Yanika Kla, there is no influence of Klipa at all. They're able to be peaceful, in other words, and which allow the masters to eat them as well. So what's the point? The point is that on shavuos, the sacrifices are connected to the bread rather than the other way around, which means there's a more human element to the sacrifice as opposed to the animal element to the sacrifice. And the idea that the sacrifice has a human element is because we're dealing with a much higher level. So much of a higher level that instead of destroying the animal completely, most of the animal can be eaten by man because it only raised up and won't be brought down.